The elephants arrive at the river and remain where they are. Nothing about the scene appears incomplete. The animals are visible, the water is visible, the setting does not change. From one day to the next, the image repeats itself with minor variations in light, position, and distance. To an observer, it feels as though all the necessary information is already present, and yet, understanding does not follow. The longer the scene is observed, the more interpretations begin to accumulate. The stillness is read as hesitation. The lack of movement is taken as avoidance. Explanations form quickly, even though nothing new has been introduced. The animals have not altered their behavior. The environment has not shifted in any obvious way. What changes is not the scene, but the meaning assigned to it. This is where the difficulty begins. Human observation is often guided by familiarity. When an animal behaves in a way that fits expectation, interpretation feels effortless. When it does not, the gap is filled with assumptions rather than restraint. The act of watching becomes an act of explanation. Here, that impulse fails. The elephants remain present and legible, but the behavior resists classification. It is not dramatic, it does not escalate, it does not resolve. Repetition does not clarify it. Instead, repetition exposes a limitation in how the scene is being read. The problem is not that the behavior is hidden. It is that visibility has been mistaken for understanding. To move forward, the behavior itself must remain untouched. What must change is the observer's approach. Not more detail, but fewer assumptions. Not deeper interpretation, but closer attention to what is actually available to perception. The scene does not need to be explained yet. It needs to be seen again without deciding what it means. The same scene, seen repeatedly. The scene does not change in any meaningful way. Across multiple observations, the elephants approach the river along the same path. Their spacing remains consistent, the waterline is reached, and movement slows until it stops. The animals remain oriented toward the river, but no entry occurs. Time passes. The light shifts. The positions adjust slightly. The configuration remains intact. This repetition is important. When an event is observed once, it invites explanation. When it is observed repeatedly, it invites pattern recognition. Here, repetition does not produce clarity. It produces familiarity. The observer becomes accustomed to the stillness and begins to anticipate it. The non-crossing becomes expected, even before it happens. At this point, observation quietly gives way to assumption. Because the outcome is known, attention narrows. The observer stops watching for what is present and starts watching for confirmation of what is expected. Small details are filtered out. The scene is reduced to a single conclusion reached too early. The elephants do not cross. But this conclusion describes an outcome, not an observation. What is actually visible is a sequence of physical states: arrival, deceleration, stationary positioning, prolonged presence. None of these states contain an explanation on their own. They are descriptive, not interpretive. The meaning assigned to them originates outside the scene. This is where perception begins to fail. Repeated exposure creates the illusion of understanding. The observer feels increasingly confident, not because new information has emerged, but because the scene has become familiar. Familiarity is mistaken for insight. The behavior feels known even though it has not been examined differently. Importantly, the animals do not respond to being watched. There is no escalation, no reaction to proximity, no adjustment that signals awareness of observation. The scene remains indifferent to interpretation. This indifference is crucial. It reveals that the behavior is not communicating something to the observer. It is simply occurring. The lack of communicative intent removes a key interpretive anchor. Without signals directed outward, the observer is left to infer meaning from form alone. This encourages projection. As days pass, observers often begin to describe the scene in shorthand. Phrases emerge that compress complexity into certainty. The elephants are waiting, they are refusing. Each term implies an internal process that cannot be seen. These terms feel natural because they align with human experience. They allow the observer to move past uncertainty, but they also replace observation with substitution. The scene is no longer being watched. It is being translated. Translation simplifies, but it also distorts. What repetition actually offers here is not explanation, but an opportunity to recognize the limits of interpretation. The behavior remains consistent, yet its meaning remains unstable. This instability persists precisely because nothing in the scene resolves it. If the elephants were to cross suddenly, the previous stillness would be reframed as delay. If danger were to appear, the stillness would be reframed as avoidance. In both cases, the meaning would be assigned retroactively. Until then, interpretation floats free of evidence. The repeated scene exposes a gap between visibility and comprehension. Nothing is hidden. The animals are fully present. The river is fully visible. The absence of action is not obscured. And yet, the observer cannot move beyond descriptive certainty into explanatory confidence. This gap is uncomfortable. Human perception is oriented toward resolution. We expect repeated observation to converge on understanding. When it does not, frustration arises. The temptation is to close the gap artificially by naming the behavior. But naming is not the same as seeing. The repeated scene does not demand explanation. It reveals the conditions under which explanation is prematurely applied. The more often the behavior is observed, the more obvious it becomes that interpretation is being driven by expectation rather than evidence. The elephants do not need to change for this realization to occur. The shift happens entirely on the side of the observer. The scene remains constant. What begins to fracture is the confidence that it has already been understood. And in that fracture, a different kind of attention becomes possible. One that does not rush to decide what the behavior means, but remains focused on what is actually there, again and again, without resolution. When interpretation starts to drift, after repetition establishes familiarity, interpretation begins to move on its own. At this stage, the observer is no longer asking what is happening. The scene appears settled. Attention shifts toward why it must be happening. The behavior is no longer approached as an open observation, but as a problem awaiting explanation. This shift is subtle, but it marks a decisive change in how the scene is processed. Nothing in the environment has changed. The elephants remain where they are. The river's surface continues to show minor, inconclusive variation. The spacing between individuals fluctuates within a narrow range. No new signals emerge. And yet, interpretation accelerates. This acceleration is driven by discomfort, with ambiguity. When observation does not yield resolution, the mind supplies it. The stillness becomes intentional. The lack of movement becomes avoidance. The duration of the pause becomes evidence of deliberation. Each of these interpretations feels plausible, not because it is supported by observation, but because it aligns with familiar explanatory frameworks. The drift begins here. Words enter the description that were not present in the scene itself. They do not arise from new data. They arise from the need to stabilize meaning. The behavior is no longer described in terms of position, orientation, and duration. It is described in terms of motive. Once this occurs, observation narrows. Details that do not fit the emerging explanation are dismissed as irrelevant. Minor movements are ignored. Variations in spacing are overlooked. The consistency of the scene is exaggerated. Even though microvariation is present, the observer's focus contracts around a single narrative thread. This contraction gives the impression of understanding. The explanation feels solid because it is internally coherent. It accounts for the lack of crossing. It resolves uncertainty. It allows the observer to move on. But coherence is not evidence. It is a property of the explanation itself, not of the behavior being observed. The scene has not confirmed the interpretation. The interpretation has simply become comfortable. At this point, the behavior is no longer being watched as behavior. It is being watched as confirmation of a conclusion already reached. The river becomes a symbol. The elephants become examples. The scene is reduced to an illustration of an idea rather than a subject of observation. This is where perceptual constraints become visible. Human observers rely heavily on outcome-based reasoning. We infer meaning from what does not happen as readily as from what does. When movement fails to occur, we treat absence as information. But absence is ambiguous. It can indicate many things, none of which are directly observable. The drift occurs because absence invites projection. The longer the elephants remain stationary, the more confident the observer becomes in the projected explanation. Time is mistaken for evidence. Duration is interpreted as deliberation. Stillness is read as resistance. None of these readings are anchored in observable change. The behavior has not evolved. Only the story around it has. This process is reinforced by language. Once a description is repeated using interpretive terms, it becomes self-validating. The behavior is now filtered through those terms, making alternative readings harder to access. Observation becomes guided by vocabulary rather than by sight. Crucially, the animals themselves do not participate in this shift. They do not react to being misunderstood. They do not correct interpretation through altered behavior. They remain indifferent to the narrative forming around them. This indifference allows interpretation to drift further without resistance. The observer, however, experiences increasing certainty. This certainty is misplaced. It is not grounded in new information. It is grounded in the reduction of ambiguity. The explanation feels satisfying because it closes a loop, not because it opens one. The drift is not malicious or careless. It is a normal consequence of perceptual limitation. Human cognition is optimized for rapid meaning-making, not prolonged uncertainty. When a scene resists explanation, the pressure to resolve it increases. The elephants provide no resolution. As a result, the observer supplies one. What is lost in this process is sensitivity to what the scene is actually offering. The behavior becomes flattened. The possibility that the interpretation itself is the limiting factor is not considered. The scene is treated as insufficiently informative, rather than the perceptual framework being insufficiently flexible. The drift is complete when interpretation feels inevitable. At that point, questioning the explanation feels unnecessary. The observer is no longer aware of interpreting. They believe they are simply seeing what is there. This belief is the constraint. The scene has not changed. The behavior has not changed. Only the observer's relationship to uncertainty has shifted. Recognizing this drift does not produce a new explanation. It produces a pause, a recognition that the meaning being assigned may say more about the limits of perception than about the animals themselves. To proceed, interpretation must be set aside again, not because it is wrong, but because it has moved too far ahead of what can be supported by observation. The next step is not to replace one explanation with another. It is to examine what, exactly, is preventing interpretation from stabilizing, and whether the limitation lies in the scene or in the tools used to read it. The constraint is not the behavior. At some point, continued observation forces a reassessment. If the scene has remained stable and interpretation continues to fail, the limitation cannot lie entirely with what is being observed. The behavior has been visible, consistent, and repeatable. Nothing about it suggests concealment or volatility. The constraint, then, must exist elsewhere. It exists in how the behavior is being approached. Human observers tend to assume that difficulty in interpretation signals complexity in the subject. When understanding does not arrive, the default conclusion is that the behavior must be unusually intricate, strategic, or deliberately opaque. This assumption feels reasonable. It preserves confidence in the observer's tools. But in this case, the assumption does not hold. The behavior itself is simple. The elephants arrive, slow, and remain. There are no branching actions, no escalation, no visible sequence that unfolds over time. The scene offers no hidden layers to uncover. It presents the same elements repeatedly, without variation sufficient to support narrative development. If interpretation continues to struggle, it is not because the behavior is complex, it is because the interpretive tools being applied are mismatched to what is present. Most observational frameworks are designed to extract meaning from change. They rely on contrast, before and after, cause and effect, action and response. When change is minimal, these frameworks lose traction. They search for signals that do not appear. The elephants do not provide contrast. There is no transition from uncertainty to resolution. No moment when the behavior shifts enough to confirm or reject an explanation. As a result, interpretive models that depend on progression stall. They cannot advance because the scene does not supply the required inputs. This mismatch produces frustration. Rather than reconsidering the framework, observers often intensify interpretation. They add layers of inference. They speculate about unseen factors. They assume that meaning exists just beyond visibility. In doing so, they preserve the expectation that explanation is possible if only more insight were applied. But the scene does not reward this effort. The behavior remains unaffected by increasingly elaborate readings. The elephants do not respond to speculation. They do not reveal additional cues when watched more closely. The attempt to extract deeper meaning yields diminishing returns. This is the point at which the observer's limitations become apparent. The difficulty lies not in the behavior's opacity, but in the observer's reliance on interpretive strategies that require variability. The elephants are not withholding information. They are offering a form of information that resists narrative expansion. What the behavior provides is not explanation, but constraint. It constrains what can be reasonably inferred. It confines interpretation to a narrow descriptive range. It refuses to support claims about motive, strategy, or internal state. Any such claims extend beyond what is observable. This refusal is not active. It is structural. The scene remains legible but non-explanatory. It allows description but resists inference. This combination is uncommon in human-centered observation, where actions are often embedded in communicative context. Here, communication is absent. Recognizing this shifts the task. The goal is no longer to explain the behavior. It is to understand why explanation feels necessary in the first place. The observer's discomfort arises from a mismatch between expectation and reality. We expect behavior to tell us something about intent or outcome. When it does not, we feel compelled to supply those elements ourselves. They continue to occupy space without resolving the observer's uncertainty. This persistence reveals that the demand for meaning is external to the scene. It is imposed by the observer, not generated by the behavior. Once this is acknowledged, the scene changes without changing. The elephants are still there. The river is unchanged. But the interpretive pressure eases. The observer no longer searches for hidden drivers or future resolution. Attention returns to what is present rather than what is missing. This does not produce an answer. It produces a recalibration. The behavior is no longer treated as a problem to be solved. It is treated as a boundary that defines what can and cannot be known through observation alone. The constraint becomes informative in itself. What emerges is a different kind of understanding, not of the elephants, but of the limits of perception applied to them. The behavior is not elusive, it is fully exposed. What proves elusive is the observer's desire for explanation where none is being offered. This realization does not end inquiry. It redirects it. Instead of asking what the behavior means, the observer must ask what kinds of behaviors resist meaning-making, and why. The elephants, by remaining unchanged, reveal something that movement would obscure, that not all visible behavior is interpretable in the way we expect. The constraint is not in the scene. It is in the assumption that observation must always lead to explanation. Tools that promise more than they deliver. When interpretation stalls, attention often turns to tools. Cameras are repositioned. Lenses change. Observation periods lengthen. Measurements are added. The assumption is that the limitation lies in resolution rather than in approach, that with better access, the behavior will yield its meaning. The scene, however, does not respond. High-definition footage captures the same sequence more clearly, but clarity does not introduce explanation. Slow motion reveals micro-adjustments in posture, but those adjustments do not accumulate into a new pattern. Extended observation confirms consistency, not cause. The promise of tools is precision. Precision, in this case, does not resolve uncertainty. This reveals a deeper constraint. Many observational tools are designed to enhance what is already interpretable. They magnify difference, isolate change, and sharpen contrast. When behavior lacks contrast, tools amplify sameness. They deliver more of what was already present. The elephants remain at the river's edge. Technological enhancement often encourages overconfidence. The presence of data creates the impression that understanding must follow. But data does not interpret itself. When the structure of the scene does not support inference, additional data increases volume, not insight. This is where misalignment becomes evident. Tools are often optimized for detecting events, entries, exits, transitions, responses. Here, the defining feature of the scene is the absence of transition. The behavior is not an event, it is a condition. Tools that excel at capturing change struggle with persistence. Attempts to extract meaning from persistence tend to revert to proxy indicators. Duration is treated as signal. Proximity is treated as intention. Orientation is treated as anticipation. Each proxy substitutes measurable features for explanatory power. The substitution feels productive because it produces numbers, but numbers do not resolve ambiguity when the link between measure and meaning is assumed rather than demonstrated. Duration does not indicate deliberation. Proximity does not indicate preference. Orientation does not indicate expectation. These associations are imported, not observed. The reliance on tools also shifts responsibility. If understanding fails, the solution appears to be better equipment rather than conceptual restraint. The observer remains confident in the interpretive framework, believing it will succeed once supplied with sufficient input. This belief delays reconsideration of the framework itself. The elephants expose this limitation by remaining unchanged under increasing scrutiny. No amount of magnification reveals a hidden sequence. No extended recording uncovers a turning point. The behavior does not yield to accumulation. It resists escalation because it is not escalatory. At this stage, the problem is no longer observational access. It is category error. The tools promise explanation because they have delivered it elsewhere. In contexts where behavior unfolds through visible stages, instrumentation reveals structure. Here, the structure is static. The tools faithfully record that static structure, but they cannot transform it into narrative. This mismatch produces a subtle distortion. Observers begin to search for meaning in the tool outputs rather than in the scene. Patterns are inferred from noise. Significance is assigned to fluctuations that do not repeat. The risk of false inference increases as confidence in the tools grows. Importantly, this process does not involve deception. It involves misplaced expectation. The elephants do not conceal information. The river does not withhold cues. The failure arises from the assumption that every persistent behavior must be decomposable into explanatory components, accessible through measurement. Some behaviors do not operate that way. They are defined by thresholds rather than trajectories. They do not unfold. They persist. Their significance lies in what they delimit, not in what they produce. Tools, designed to capture production, struggle to register delimitation. Recognizing this shifts the observer's task again. Instead of seeking better tools, the observer must question what kind of understanding is being pursued. If the goal is to explain why the elephants do not cross, the available evidence remains insufficient. If the goal is to understand why that explanation remains elusive, the evidence is already complete. The scene has been offering that answer continuously. The tools have not failed. They have performed exactly as designed. What they reveal over and over is the same boundary. Increased precision does not resolve interpretive uncertainty when the uncertainty is not caused by lack of detail. The promise of tools becomes a distraction when it postpones conceptual adjustment. The elephants do not require more observation. They require a different relationship to observation. The scene remains visible, the behavior remains unchanged. What must change is the expectation that every observed pattern will surrender its meaning under scrutiny. The observer enters the frame. At a certain point, the boundary between observation and interpretation collapses, not because the scene changes, but because the observer becomes impossible to ignore. The elephants remain at the river. Their positions shift slightly. The water reflects light differently as the day progresses. Nothing in the behavior announces a new phase, and yet, the act of watching begins to shape what is perceived. Attention is no longer neutral. It is guided by expectation, language, and prior exposure. The observer enters the frame, not physically, but cognitively. This entry alters the structure of observation. What is noticed is filtered through what is sought. When the observer expects explanation, attention gravitates toward elements that seem explanatory, even if they are incidental. When the observer expects resolution, stillness becomes frustrating rather than informative. The scene itself does not invite this shift. It tolerates it. Human perception rarely operates without reference points. We look for cause, sequence, and outcome because those elements organize experience. In their absence, we substitute ourselves. We fill the gap with interpretive habits that originate outside the scene. Here, that substitution becomes visible. Descriptions begin to reflect the observer's position rather than the animal's. Distance is framed as reluctance. Duration is framed as intent. Orientation is framed as anticipation. These framings feel natural because they mirror human decision-making. They convert observation into a mirror. But mirrors do not reveal their subjects. They reveal their users. The elephants do not provide access to internal states. They do not correct misreadings. They do not alter behavior in response to being misinterpreted. This silence allows the observer's assumptions to accumulate unchecked. As a result, the scene becomes less about elephants and more about the expectations imposed upon them. This shift explains why interpretations vary across observers. Different viewers emphasize different aspects of the same scene. Not because the scene supports multiple explanations, but because it supports projection. The behavior is stable enough to accommodate many readings without confirming any of them. The observer's background begins to matter. Training, cultural narratives, prior encounters with animals all shape what feels plausible. An observer accustomed to intentional action may infer deliberation. An observer focused on threat may infer avoidance. Each interpretation says more about the interpretive lens than about the behavior. The scene becomes a test of perception rather than a source of answers. Importantly, this does not invalidate observation. It clarifies its limits. Observation does not fail because it lacks detail. It fails because it cannot separate what is seen from how it is seen. The elephants remain indifferent to this distinction. They do not offer feedback that privileges one interpretation over another. They remain equally consistent under all readings. This consistency strips authority from interpretation and returns attention to the act of observing itself. At this stage, the observer faces a choice. One option is to assert an explanation anyway, to select the most comfortable interpretation, and proceed as if it were confirmed. This restores narrative control but sacrifices fidelity to evidence. The other option is to accept the presence of the observer within the frame and account for it. This requires acknowledging that interpretation is being shaped by perceptual habit rather than by behavioral signal. Choosing the second option changes the nature of inquiry. The question is no longer, what are the elephants doing? It becomes, why does this behavior invite explanation where none can be confirmed? This reframing does not diminish the scene. It deepens it. The elephants are no longer treated as objects withholding meaning. They are treated as constants against which the observer's interpretive tendencies become visible. The scene functions as a reference point, revealing how quickly certainty is manufactured when ambiguity persists. The observer's entry into the frame does not contaminate the scene. It completes it. What was previously treated as a failure of understanding becomes a demonstration of how understanding is constructed. The elephants do not change. The observer does. And in that change, the original assumption that visibility guarantees interpretability begins to erode. The scene remains unresolved, but the source of that unresolved state is no longer misattributed. It is not the animal's silence that frustrates explanation. It is the observer's expectation that explanation must exist. Recognizing this does not end observation. It refines it. The elephants remain at the river, unchanged. What has shifted is the recognition that meaning is not always something waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes it is something imposed, and sometimes the most accurate response is to notice that imposition without replacing it. When questions outpace answers. As observation continues, a shift becomes unavoidable. The longer the elephants remain unchanged, the more apparent it becomes that questions are multiplying faster than answers. Each attempt to clarify the behavior generates additional uncertainty rather than resolution. Explanations do not converge, they diverge. This divergence is not caused by new evidence. It is caused by the absence of limits on interpretation. When a scene resists explanation, inquiry often expands outward. Context is added. Hypotheses accumulate. External references are introduced. The behavior itself remains the same, but the interpretive field grows increasingly crowded. Instead of narrowing understanding, observation widens speculation. At this point, the balance between evidence and inference breaks down. Questions begin to exceed what the scene can support. Why this river and not another? Why this moment and not earlier? Why no individual deviation? Each question implies that an answer must exist somewhere beyond the visible frame. The assumption is that explanation has merely been displaced, not invalidated. But displacement is not guaranteed. The elephants do not respond to deeper questioning with new signals. They do not alter their positioning in ways that suggest hidden structure. The river does not reveal features that clarify decision-making. The scene remains structurally closed. This closure is not a failure of observation. It is a characteristic of the behavior. Some behaviors are self-limiting in what they reveal. They do not scale with scrutiny. They do not unfold additional layers under pressure. Instead, they maintain a fixed profile that resists expansion into narrative. When questions outpace answers, the observer faces a critical choice. One option is to continue generating questions, regardless of evidentiary support. This creates the impression of depth, but risks detachment from the scene itself. Inquiry becomes speculative rather than grounded. The behavior becomes a pretext for broader theorizing rather than the focus of attention. The other option is to recognize the mismatch. The scene is not incomplete. It is complete in a way that does not accommodate the kinds of questions being asked. The failure lies not in the lack of information, but in the expectation that information must resolve uncertainty. This recognition alters the function of questioning. Questions are no longer treated as paths to answers. They become indicators of perceptual limits. Each unanswered question highlights a boundary beyond which observation cannot reliably extend. This does not render the questions meaningless. It reframes their purpose. Instead of asking why the elephants do not cross, the observer begins to ask why that question feels necessary, why stillness demands explanation, why absence of action is treated as evidence of hidden process rather than as a condition in itself. These questions turn inward. They expose the assumptions embedded in observational practice, the belief that behavior must be interpretable, the expectation that repetition yields understanding, the confidence that sufficient scrutiny will eventually uncover cause. The elephants quietly undermine these assumptions. They demonstrate that visibility does not guarantee interpretability, that repetition can stabilize uncertainty rather than resolve it. That behavior can be fully accessible and still resist explanation. When questions outpace answers, persistence becomes instructive. The elephants do not force resolution. They do not reward inquiry with insight. They maintain the same configuration regardless of how intensely they are examined. This indifference reveals that some phenomena are not structured to satisfy explanatory demand. The observer's role changes again. Instead of extracting meaning, the observer begins to map the limits of extraction. Attention shifts from the behavior to the conditions under which understanding fails. The scene becomes a case study, not in animal behavior, but in perceptual expectation. This shift is subtle but decisive. It does not replace one explanation with another. It removes explanation from the center of inquiry. The goal is no longer to solve the scene, but to understand why it cannot be solved in the expected way. The elephants remain at the river. They do not confirm or deny any interpretation. They do not respond to expanded questioning. Their behavior does not scale with curiosity. It remains fixed, exposing the asymmetry between observation and explanation. At this point, the observer must accept that continued questioning will not produce answers proportionate to the effort invested. This acceptance is not resignation. It is calibration. It aligns inquiry with what the scene can reasonably offer. The questions that remain are no longer about the elephant's internal states or future actions. They are about the observer's need for resolution and the frameworks that generate that need. When questions outpace answers, the most informative response is not to ask better questions. It is to recognize that the structure of the scene defines the limits of what questions can meaningfully be asked. The meaning that never arrives. At a certain stage, expectation collapses. Not abruptly, but gradually, through repetition that no longer promises resolution. The elephants continue to occupy the same space at the river's edge. The water continues to move, without obvious change. Observation continues, but the anticipation of meaning begins to weaken. This is not because meaning has been disproven. It is because it has failed to arrive. Human perception is structured around arrival. We expect moments to lead somewhere, toward action, toward decision, toward outcome. When a scene resists this structure, discomfort accumulates. The observer waits for a reveal that never comes. The elephants do not provide it. They do not cross. They do not retreat. They do not escalate. The scene remains suspended, and with that suspension, the assumption that meaning must emerge begins to erode. What becomes evident is that the behavior does not point beyond itself. It does not function as a sign or signal awaiting interpretation. It simply persists. The longer this persistence continues, the less convincing any explanatory overlay becomes. Interpretations lose traction not because they are challenged, but because they are unsupported. This absence of support is subtle. There is no contradiction. No single moment invalidates an explanation. Instead, each explanation fades through lack of confirmation. The behavior neither affirms nor denies. It remains neutral. Neutrality is difficult to process. In many observational contexts, neutrality is temporary, a pause before change. Here, neutrality is the condition itself. The scene is not waiting to resolve. It is complete as it is. The failure of meaning to arrive reveals something important. The expectation of meaning was imported into the scene rather than generated by it. The elephants do not organize their behavior to be legible to human observers. They do not structure stillness as communication. They do not escalate to signal intent. The scene offers no cues that suggest interpretation is required. The demand for meaning originates elsewhere. As observation continues without payoff, a quiet recalibration occurs. The observer stops anticipating revelation. Attention shifts from what the behavior might indicate to what it actually consists of: presence, orientation, duration, repetition. This shift does not simplify the scene. It strips it of narrative obligation. Without the pressure to resolve, the scene becomes stable rather than frustrating. The elephants are no longer treated as withholding information. they are recognized as not offering it in the first place. This recognition marks a turning point. The absence of meaning is no longer a problem to be solved. It becomes a feature of the observation. The behavior is understood as one that does not translate into human explanatory categories. This does not render the behavior trivial. On the contrary, it reveals a class of phenomena that resist interpretation not through complexity, but through persistence. The scene does not evolve toward clarity. It maintains a steady state that undermines narrative expectation. The observer's role adjusts accordingly. Instead of searching for hidden drivers or future outcomes, the observer begins to note the stability itself. The lack of arrival becomes informative. It signals that the behavior's significance does not lie in what it leads to, but in how it occupies time. This is a difficult adjustment. Human observers are accustomed to extracting meaning through progression. When progression is absent, attention often disengages. Here, however, disengagement would miss the point. The persistence is the point. The elephants remain at the river not as a prelude, but as a condition. The scene does not gesture toward explanation. It demonstrates the limits of expectation. What ultimately fails is not interpretation, but the assumption that interpretation is always appropriate. The meaning that never arrives reveals that some behaviors do not function as messages. They do not invite decoding. They exist without regard for observer comprehension. Accepting this does not end inquiry. It refines it. The observer learns to distinguish between behaviors that can be explained and behaviors that can only be described. The elephants belong to the latter category not because they are unknowable, but because they do not produce the kind of variation that explanation requires. The river remains unchanged. The elephants remain present. Meaning does not arrive because it was never promised. What arrives instead is a clearer understanding of the boundary between seeing and knowing, and of how easily that boundary is mistaken for a challenge rather than a limit. What remains when explanation is removed? When explanation is set aside, the scene does not collapse, it becomes quieter. The elephants remain at the river's edge, as they have throughout. Their presence is unchanged. The water continues to move in small, inconclusive ways. No new action emerges. What changes is the absence of interpretive pressure. The behavior is no longer required to signify anything beyond what is visible. This removal is revealing. Without explanation, what remains is structure. Bodies arranged in relation to one another, orientation toward a boundary. Duration measured not as delay, but as continuity. The scene is composed of stable elements that do not point elsewhere. They hold their position in time without progressing toward outcome. This stability is not empty. It contains information of a different kind, information that does not translate into motive or cause, but into limits. The behavior defines a boundary in the landscape, not by crossing it or retreating from it, but by remaining in its presence. The river is not engaged. The elephants are not withdrawn. What exists is a sustained interface. Seen this way, the behavior is no longer about action withheld. It is about a relationship maintained. The animals occupy a position relative to the environment without attempting to resolve that relationship through movement. The scene persists as a configuration rather than an event. This reframing alters what can be known. When explanation is removed, the observer no longer asks what the elephants intend to do next. Attention shifts to what the scene demonstrates about continuity, tolerance, and boundary conditions. The behavior shows how long a system can remain stable without transition. This is difficult to register because it contradicts narrative habit. Narratives depend on change. They move from state to state. Here, change is absent. The significance lies precisely in that absence. They do not exist to move something forward. They exist to hold a position. What remains, then, is duration as data. Duration without escalation. Presence without resolution. These are not placeholders for future action. They are the behavior itself. Removing explanation also removes hierarchy. The behavior is no longer subordinate to an unseen cause or future outcome. It stands on its own terms. The elephants are not performing a prelude to something else. They are not engaged in a process that will eventually reveal its purpose. They are simply present in a sustained configuration. This recognition shifts the observer's stance again. The need to interpret gives way to the ability to witness. The scene is no longer evaluated for meaning. It is acknowledged for persistence. This does not diminish its significance. It relocates it. The behavior's importance lies not in what it explains, but in what it demonstrates about the limits of explanation. It shows that visibility does not guarantee interpretability, that repetition does not ensure clarity, that some patterns resist translation into cause and effect frameworks. The elephants do not obscure understanding, they delineate it. By remaining unchanged, they reveal how much of interpretation depends on expectation rather than evidence. When expectation is removed, the scene does not become meaningless. It becomes bounded. It defines where observation can go and where it cannot. What remains is a kind of clarity. Not clarity about why the elephants remain at the river, but clarity about what can be said responsibly. The observer can describe position, duration, and consistency. The observer cannot infer motive, strategy, or future action without leaving the evidence behind. This boundary is not a failure. It is a constraint that, once recognized, stabilizes observation. The scene no longer provokes speculation, it no longer invites projection. It is allowed to remain what it is, a sustained configuration at the edge of a boundary. The elephants continue to stand where they have stood all along. The river continues to mark a division in space. Nothing resolves, because nothing is meant to. What remains when explanation is removed is not confusion. It is restraint. And in that restraint, the observer finally aligns with the scene not by understanding it, but by no longer demanding that it explain itself. Seeing more, understanding less. As observation persists, tools multiply, cameras extend reach, sensors increase resolution, recording time expands. Each edition promises to narrow uncertainty by capturing what might have been missed. The assumption is straightforward. More data will produce more understanding. The scene does not respond to this promise. Higher resolution reveals texture without clarifying meaning. Longer recordings confirm consistency without introducing explanation. Alternative angles provide redundancy rather than insight. The elephants remain present. The river remains unchanged. The tools succeed in documenting the scene more completely, but completeness does not translate into interpretation. This outcome exposes a mismatch. Most observational tools are designed to register change. They excel at detecting transitions, anomalies, and responses. Here, the defining feature is persistence. The behavior does not unfold, it endures. Tools calibrated for events struggle with conditions that do not evolve. In response, interpretation shifts toward proxies. Duration becomes a substitute for intent. Proximity becomes a substitute for evaluation. Orientation becomes a substitute for anticipation. These substitutions feel analytical because they are measurable, but measurement does not confer meaning when the relationship between metric and explanation is assumed rather than demonstrated. The presence of tools also alters the observer's confidence. Data accumulation can create the impression that understanding is inevitable, that with sufficient input, explanation must follow. When it does not, the tendency is to intensify analysis, rather than reconsider the premise. The observer trusts the instruments and questions the scene. Yet the scene remains indifferent. This indifference reveals a second limitation. Tools do not correct interpretive bias. They record faithfully, but they do not adjudicate meaning. When a behavior offers no progression, tools amplify the absence of progression. They do not resolve it. At this point, the observer confronts a choice similar to the one faced earlier with interpretation itself. Either insist that better tools will eventually unlock explanation, or accept that the behavior does not present itself in a form that tools are designed to decode. Accepting the latter reframes the role of instrumentation. Tools become descriptive rather than revelatory. They establish boundaries rather than breakthroughs. They confirm what can be said, with certainty, presence, duration, consistency, and, just as importantly, what cannot. This reframing does not diminish the value of tools. It situates them correctly. The elephants do not become more understandable under scrutiny, because understanding was never withheld. What was withheld was confirmation of the observer's expectations. Tools cannot supply that confirmation when the behavior does not contain it. In this light, the accumulation of data becomes instructive in a different way. It demonstrates that limitation is not always a problem of access. Sometimes it is a property of the phenomenon itself. The tools have done their work. What remains is not a hidden explanation waiting to be extracted, but a clear outline of where observation ends and interpretation begins, and where, in this case, interpretation finds no foothold. Where observation must stop. At the edge of prolonged observation, a boundary becomes clear. Not a boundary in the landscape, but a boundary in comprehension. The elephants remain visible, consistent, and unchanged. The tools have recorded them thoroughly. The interpretations have been tested and set aside. What remains is a recognition that understanding does not always advance with effort. This boundary is not imposed by secrecy. Nothing in the scene is concealed. There are no missing angles, no inaccessible details, no hidden movements waiting to be revealed. The limitation arises because the behavior does not generate the kind of variation that supports explanation. It does not progress, resolve, or communicate. It persists. Human understanding often depends on sequence. We infer meaning from transitions before and after. Cause and effect. When a behavior remains in a steady state, those inferential pathways fail. The absence of change is not a gap to be filled. It is the defining feature of the phenomenon. Recognizing this requires restraint. It requires accepting that some observations do not culminate in answers, not because the answers are difficult, but because the questions being asked exceed what the scene can supply. This acceptance is uncomfortable, but it is precise. The elephants do not frustrate understanding. They delimit it. By remaining unchanged, they show that explanation is not an entitlement granted by visibility. It is a conditional outcome that depends on the structure of what is observed. When that structure does not support inference, the responsible response is not speculation, but acknowledgement. This acknowledgement does not end inquiry. It clarifies its scope. Observation can describe. It can compare. It can document persistence. What it cannot do, in this case, is convert stillness into motive or duration into intent, without departing from evidence. The limit of understanding is reached not when observation fails, but when observation succeeds completely and still offers no explanation. At that point, the boundary is no longer in the world, it is in the demand placed upon it. What we learn by not knowing. The elephants never cross the river, they also never explain why. What changes is not their behavior, but our willingness to accept that some scenes do not resolve into answers. In observing what remains unchanged, we are forced to confront how often understanding is assumed rather than earned. Which moment in this observation altered your expectations most, the repetition, the failure of tools, or the realization that explanation may not apply here at all? And what other behaviors deserve to be watched without forcing them to mean something they never offered? If you choose the next scene, what would you be willing to observe without demanding an answer?